This week on the Lectures in History podcast, University of Southern California sociology assistant professor Brittany Friedman explores the history and evolution of prison gangs going back to the mid-20th century. Before then, American prisons saw little in the way of organized gang structure. Violence and crime behind bars were primarily isolated incidents rather than coordinated efforts. But over time, informal alliances, often based on race, ethnicity, or geography, laid the groundwork for the highly structured gangs that would follow. Professor Friedman is the author of Carceral Apartheid: How Lies and White Supremacists Run Our Prisons.
This episode is brought to you by Peacock. The new Peacock original documentary, Matthew Perry, A Hollywood Tragedy, dives deep into the beloved actor's rise to fame and his tragic death. 5 people, including Perry's personal assistant, 2 medical doctors, and an alleged Hollywood drug dealer known as the Ketamine Queen, were charged with conspiracy to illegally provide Perry with the ketamine. Explore the details of the case in this heartbreaking special, streaming now only on Peacock.
At T-Mobile, our critical mission is providing unparalleled 5G coverage for when connectivity is mission critical. Introducing T-Priority, America's best 5G network experience for first responders, even in times of congestion. More capacity, faster speeds, better coverage. T-Priority from T-Mobile, built for tomorrow's emergencies, ready today. Discover more at t-priority.com.
For qualifying organizations on eligible rate plans, coverage not available in some areas and may be impacted by emergencies.
Hi everyone, I'm very happy to see you today. So, as you can see, the topic of my lecture today is the history of American prison gangs. And this is a topic that I very much love to teach. It's very important. And as you will see, our state of California plays a very important role. So prison gangs have arguably captured the American imagination for almost 8 decades. That is almost 80 years. We have been fascinated in a variety of ways with prison gangs, whether it be as scholars as we are today, or in movies, in memoirs. And so what the state labels as prison gangs, and you'll see why I'm putting that in quotes, are actually prisoner organizations with a hierarchical pyramid-like structure, typically seen in militaries. We see this same structure in mafias and rebel armies, and also other types of armed groups. And so, like other groups, prisoner organizations are born from politics. And this is very important, as we're going to see. They are also born out of conflict. They're born out of struggles. And scholars, we kind of have a little bit of beef, if you will, about we kind of differ, and we argue politely as to what these struggles are over. Like, what are they fighting for? And so some people will say that the struggle is purely economic and a desire to control very valuable commodities. And so these commodities could be drugs, they could be territory, human labor, or natural resources. But others, and I'm going to be over in this intellectual camp, argue that before you see any of these conflicts really take off about economic power, you first must have struggles over who belongs on what side and under what banner, and essentially who's a member of your group. And as you will learn in this semester, right, over time, and you'll learn today for sure, race is a very important group in terms of thinking about what banner are you going to fly under and what side are you going to be on. So we're thinking race and ethnicity, and so keep that in your minds as I'm talking. And importantly, who does not fly your banner? Who's not on your side? Who is not going to eventually take up arms with you in an impending struggle? And so it is these racial and ethnic boundary lines that are so ingrained into our unconscious and conscious decision making and determines who's a natural ally when we feel, importantly, when we feel unsafe, when we feel insecure, and who is not. And so if you think about this now for yourselves, right, like who do you trust will fight with you in this impending struggle? Some people might put it, I think, right, in this generation, even in my generation, right, like who's gonna ride for you during these times of struggle? Think about that, and that's very important. And how do you make that decision? And it often happens unconsciously, but also very consciously. And so it's race and ethnic identity then, that this sense of self that we hold an emotional and social attachment to, that's going to play the biggest role in the politics that spawn such groups, and prisoner organizations are included. And so if you look closely, the state, which means our government institutions, they play a large role in the formations of organizations that the state eventually comes to label and incarcerate either as criminal, or as a combatant, or as a rebel group. And as you'll see today, despite claims by law enforcement that it is strictly us versus them in a fight between good versus evil, or we could say a fight between what is criminal and what is here to save us, what I'm going to show you today will actually debunk these dichotomies and labels, and instead I will show you how the lines are much more blurred. And so this is why if you look at the history really of any type of organization that has captured both the public imagination, and the most wanted lists of federal governments, you will see that the state's hands are typically bloody with corruption and intention. And so things are not as cut and dry as we might usually be led to believe. And so interestingly, our state of California holds the seeds to the origin story for 4 of the most well-known prisoner organizations in American history. And so these include the Mexican Mafia, the Aryan Brotherhood, the Black Guerrilla Family, and the Nuestra Familia. What planted those seeds is the subject of today's lecture. And so we're going to think through together. 1, why did they rise up at the same time in history? In a very short time span, they all formed side by side, and that's not a coincidence. And some formed together in the sense of creating alliances, others actually fighting to the death in a state-sponsored race war that has lasted for decades in California and continues today. We will peel back the layer of these origin stories by starting with the life and death of someone I chronicle in my book, Carceral Apartheid: How Lies and White Supremacists Run Our Prisons. And this person is someone who, as we'll see, he goes on to co-found one of the prisoner organizations that I just named. In 1965, Hugo, and he was affectionately called Yogi Bear, Pinnell, was sentenced to 3 years to life. In his writings and in the interview that I did with a member of his family, it was very clear that he did not know he would spend a lifetime in darkness. And arguably, no one imagines that they would live for 45 years in solitary confinement, as we will see. Because if you knew, many people would rightfully panic. Many people would experience, as has been documented, for people who are prisoners of war, a sense of paralysis or hopelessness, or the will or efforts to survive by any means necessary. And in some of his letters to his mother in particular, he talked a lot about now not being the time to feel. Almost like a sense of hardening that happens when you are in a very traumatic situation and you have to think through, how am I going to make it out of this? And often we see in the writings of incarcerated people, especially those that have spent so many decades in solitary confinement, there is a shutting off that happens for people of certain aspects of themselves so that they can feel like they remain sane in this situation. And that is very true for Hugo. And many people that I spoke to in the course of learning about his life, and other people that served time with him, and people that served time fighting against him, really spoke about how certain prisons in California, San Quentin in particular, as someone who eventually became an affiliate of the Aryan Brotherhood, who I interviewed, he explained to me, he's like, San Quentin, like other prisons like Folsom, Soledad, they're gladiator schools, right? So that creates an environment where people are going to be in fight or flight mode. And as I keep talking, we will see why that is consistent and constant, but why it's not just happening from incarcerated people themselves, as we might expect, right? Or as we might have been taught to expect from certain theories of criminology. Instead, I will show how prison officials and correctional officers are playing a very active role in creating this environment of fight or flight and fear that is leading to cycles and cycles of racialized violence. And so Hugo is surviving this. And what's important to note is that, like everyone else in this room, and like all of us, we all have a life story. We have an early origin story. And so something that was important to me was to get to know not just Hugo, co-founder of the Black Guerrilla Family, one of the 4 major prisoner organizations that started in California and now is nationwide, but to understand, how did he get here? What is Hugo's story? And I did that with everyone I interviewed, regardless of what organization they claimed during their incarceration. And so Hugo, I learned that he was born in 1945, and he self-identified as Moreno, and he saw himself as being a black man in California. He came here to the United States at the age of 12. He spoke a lot about how he came from Nicaragua. He spoke a lot about how his mother saw America and California as a place to start over. He spoke a lot about the American dream and how that was important. And these are all things that he's speaking about and recounting to his family, and things that I'm learning then through his family, right? And so all of these dreams and hopes, they really come crashing down for Hugo as he comes of age in California. And so in 1965, Hugo actually is sentenced 3 years to life. And the case surrounding his conviction, it has been for years disputed and contested by activists and civil rights attorneys because, one, he was tortured in custody before he confessed to what led to his conviction. And also the circumstances surrounding his conviction very much resembles the wrongful convictions that black men in the American South and Midwest in particular faced just before being threatened or killed through lynching. And so what's important, though, as I stated, right, we're talking about California and people migrating to California in hopes of having a better life. And Hugo's not the only one that has this story, as you'll find out as I keep explaining. And so one of Hugo's closest associates actually said in an interview, and I'm quoting, he said, "If Hugo knew the hell he would face in America, would he have left the land of his birth? We'll never know. He came, yet that wasn't the beginning nor the end of things." And that's Hugo actually crouching down on the left that's him as a young man. And so Hugo actually, he eventually over time called many prisons in California his cage. But in his interviews and writings, he very much emphasized their passing nature. And you could tell in his writings and his speaking with his family that his experiences in California prisons were actually making him become, scholars would use the term radicalized, in the sense of when someone experiences a series of degradations or torture, or the various types of murders that he witnessed in California prisons, there becomes a process where people's politics shift, right? And people begin to realize that organizing themselves into a formal group and taking up arms might just be the only way to survive this setup. And so for Hugo, there's an infamous case in California history where in Soledad prison, 3 of Hugo's closest associates are actually shot and executed in broad daylight by Opie Miller, who is a white correctional officer with a history of reported abuse against incarcerated Black people. And so for Hugo, this was a breaking point. He actually wrote a very long letter after this incident describing his anger, but also describing what, as he called it, his fellow comrades were witnessing the day of the murders, and how it really crystallized for them that their lives were considered meaningless by the Department of Corrections in California. And also what's important is that when this incident takes place, the circumstances of the shooting are important because they are going to show you a pattern that continues to repeat itself even in the present moment, but a pattern that also helps us understand how the Black guerrilla family's rival organization, the Aryan Brotherhood, gets their start at the same time. So the circumstances around the shooting are essentially that a group of 3 self-identified Black militants, meaning that they saw themselves as being aligned with the Black freedom movement of the 50s and 60s and 70s. So they see themselves as being aligned, and they begin to circulate a petition asking other incarcerated people to sign it because they are tired of the targeting of the civil rights movement and the Black freedom movement on the inside. And they also are trying to unite people across race. So they actually succeed in getting some signatures across racial and ethnic boundaries, which makes it very, we can imagine the word is, I would say, dangerous, right? It makes it dangerous because if you're able to begin to get people to see themselves as being all prisoners versus seeing each other as we're fighting against each other and you're a white prisoner, you're a Black prisoner, you're this, but instead to say, no, we're all actually prisoners. And his name is W.L. Nolan. He is one of Hugo's teachers, a friend, but he's the main one that is successful in really uniting people around this petition and wants to file a lawsuit. And so civil rights activists argue, and Hugo argues, that that's the real reason why the day of the shooting, he was one of the 3 people that were killed by Opie Miller, that he was put on the yard with the Aryan Brotherhood and was outnumbered because he had successfully organized everyone against the prison. And so they end up getting killed, and it is as I was saying earlier, it's an infamous chapter of California history more broadly, not just prison history. And so in 1970, shortly after this happens, the Department of Corrections actually starts to transfer people into San Quentin, thinking that, okay, we're going to separate some of the leaders of the different Black militant cliques. They're upset, they're angry, But they actually, they transfer a sizable amount of people to San Quentin in one place. And there were already people there as well that were organizing. And so this gives what will become the Black guerrilla family a stronghold in San Quentin. And so certain of the only solution being formal organization, Hugo helped co-found the Black guerrilla family in 1970 in San Quentin with approximately about 9 other people. And so I say that because in my interviews with living co-founders of the Black guerrilla family that are out and not incarcerated anymore, they it was like a dispute. It was like over like a certain person. So I always say 9 to 10 because it was back and forth about whether or not that person is really a co-founder or if they're just an early member. So the goal at this time is to give Black incarcerated people the best chance of surviving the California Department of Corrections and, as we'll see, surviving more setups that are occurring because corrupt white correctional officers are aligning themselves with self-identified Nazis that end up consolidating themselves into the Aryan Brotherhood.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment.
Revolutionize your cooking with the Tefal infrared air fryer. Watch as your food crisps up through a large lighted window and delight in faster, crispier, and juicier results with no preheating thanks to Tefal's advanced infrared technology. Discover the future of cooking and bring innovation into your kitchen by visiting Tefal.com.
Oh my God, it's the coolest thing ever. Hey guys, have you heard of Goldbelly? Well, check this out. It's this amazing site where they ship the most iconic, famous foods from restaurants across the country, anywhere nationwide. I've never found a more perfect gift than food. They ship Chicago deep dish pizza, New York bagels, Maine lobster rolls, and even Ina Garten's famous cakes. Seriously. So if you're looking for a gift for the food lover in your life, head to goldbelly.com and get 20% off your first order with promo code GIFT.
This episode is brought to you by Rakuten. If you're shopping while working, eating, or even listening to this podcast, then you know and love the thrill of the hunt. But are you getting the thrill of the best deals? Rakuten shoppers do. They get the brands they love with the most savings and cash back. And you can get it too. Start getting cash back at your favorite stores like Samsung, Expedia, and Sephora. And even stack sales on top of cash back. It's easy to use, and you get your cash back through PayPal or check. The idea is simple. Stores pay Rakuten for sending them shoppers, and Rakuten shares the money with you as cash back. Download the free Rakuten app and never miss a deal. Or go to Rakuten.com to start getting the most bang for your buck. That's Rakuten.
¿Hablas español?
Sprichst du Deutsch?
Kann du noch?
If you've heard that sound from Babbel before, I bet you do. Babbel is the science-backed language learning app that actually works. With quick 10-minute lessons handcrafted by over 200 language experts, Babbel gets you on your way to speaking a new language in just a few weeks. With over 16 million subscriptions sold and a 20-day money-back guarantee, just start speaking another language with Babbel. Right now, up to 55% off your Babbel subscription at babbel.com/Spotify podcast. Spelled BABBEL.com/Spotify podcast. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
And so Hugo becomes even, very well known within the prison system, more so than he already was, in terms of being very outspoken against correctional officer violence. But he enters what I would consider to be the world stage on August 21st, 1971, when he attempts to free a fellow co-founder of the Black guerrilla family, George Jackson, who's probably the most famous co-founder of the Black guerrilla family. And Hugo helps and assists in trying to free Jackson from San Quentin in order to save him from being next. Because remember, as I said, their comrade, 3 of them, but W.L. Nolan in particular, who was very much influential as a strategist and seen as an organizer, was murdered in Soledad. And so George Jackson is very valuable to the Black guerrilla family because he was considered a military genius by them. He had read So at the time of his murder, there's a famous list of books that were stacked way high that were found in his cell, and you can look up that list if you're interested in what he was reading. But he was reading Mao. He was reading, for sociologists, right? He's reading Marx. He's reading Durkheim. He was reading Du Bois. So he was considered extremely valuable because he had read. He knew how to apply this to the prison context and make sense of what they were surviving. He also was very good, just like Nolan, of mobilizing people across other racial groups. So he was good at convincing, for example, other incarcerated people who were not Black that, hey, the department is benefiting by us fighting against each other because we're not focusing our attention on them. We're focusing our attention on each other. And by doing this, we are allowing them to control us. It's very easy to control us. But if we actually think together, then we would be very dangerous for them because we outnumber them. And so George was very good at making these arguments. And so it is arguably these are the main reasons why those that were close to him believe he was the next target. And so this escape attempt was planned, but eventually it fails, which is very well known in California and also American history. It fails. And with that comes a series of events that basically change not just prison history, but with George Jackson's death, we have very shortly after that, in September, beginning on September 9th in New York, we have the Attica uprisings. George Jackson's death is very important for that. What's interesting too is in the course of my interviews with the other co-founders of the Black Guerrilla family, I learned about how they constructed a manifesto. And their manifesto is almost word for word the manifesto that is used in Attica in the state of New York when they rebel against that prison in the Attica uprising. So you see the far reach of the Black Guerrilla family, of its co-founders, of their writings and their teachings, very much resonating with the politics of the time. And so for his participation in this escape attempt, Hugo would spend the rest of his life in darkness, over 45 years in solitary confinement. And so this image is an image of him, and you can't see it on the screen fully, but just below there, that sign, he's holding it, and it says Pelican Bay. And so Pelican Bay, as we will talk about more, it becomes very important as a supermax in California. So Hugo spends 45 years in solitary confinement as a result, as punishment really for his participation in this escape attempt. And I learned through my research that in the 1980s, Hugo even survives the Aryan Brotherhood throwing a homemade bomb directly at him. And if this wasn't enough, Hugo somehow managed to survive different types of setups. So even literally and figuratively, it was described to me being stabbed in the back by one of his own associates, so someone he thinks he's close to, but the department was very effective at planting informants throughout the organization, which is a strategy that the federal government, the FBI, does very well. But as I show in my work, that California prison officials were also very effective at using counterintelligence program type tactics from the federal government within California prisons. So Hugo manages to survive a lot in the decades that he's incarcerated here, but he's a human being. And so he cannot survive forever. He can't resist this forever, even though, as his family member said, he was constantly, They described how he was constantly exercising. He was constantly trying to use his mind because he didn't want his circumstance to break him. And so, people, for example, that are in Pelican Bay, it's a supermax institution, so you spend at least 23 hours out of a 24-hour day in a cell. And so you could imagine, how someone might try to survive when they can feel themselves mentally and physically breaking down. I talk about in my book, and I quote some of his writings and letters where he's talking about, reaching for different family members and not knowing if they're real. And that's a very common symptom that doctors who have studied people that have survived solitary note. It's a very common symptom, to see apparitions and not know if they're there. So Hugo, he survives this only to, in 2015, he dies in what his family argued was a setup. And so on August 12th, 2015, Hugo is murdered by the Aryan Brotherhood, which I will describe the circumstances of it next. But what's interesting about his murder is that a witness who was there, and the witness wrote a letter to the San Francisco Bayview, which is a newspaper in Bay Area, about what he saw. And the witness, he describes how, and I'm quoting, Hugo's eyes were wide open as he took his last breath. And he basically is describing how he can't get the image out of his head of seeing this and seeing his eyes be open. And so Jason Weaver and Waylon Pitchford, two associates of the Aryan Brotherhood, they stabbed Hugo Pennell to death on August 12, 2015, and fulfilling a near 50-year prophecy. The Aryan Brotherhood lay in wait, issuing a death notice for Hugo ever since that fateful day on August 21st, 1971, when two of their members perished attempting to prevent George Jackson's escape from San Quentin. And corrections officials knew this. Some claim they knew it because it was in Hugo's file, like in his files documenting his entire incarceration history. Others claim they knew it because they helped issue it. And so his family filed, shortly after his murder, his family files a wrongful death suit claiming that the Department of Corrections is playing a role because of this long-standing vendetta against their family member. And then others, his comrades, actually, they called Weaver and Pitchford white supremacist agents of the state, is a direct quote, and saying that the Department of the Corrections is the real monster, and arguing that, Hugo is dying in the present time in the very same way that many of their comrades had died over the decades in California prisons in these yard fights where people are outnumbered, where, as I told you in the past, officers are shooting, but they're only shooting at one group. Or in this case, he's stabbed to death and he's outnumbered. So we have to think about these events as being a part of a larger history, right? We can't think of these as isolated incidents, or think of these stories or Hugo's life or the life of his comrades and co-founders of the Black Guerrilla family. We can't think of that as existing in a vacuum. We have to think about the broader socio-historical context of what they're surviving, and also of social and political formations that are actually quite common in the United States. And the formation I'm talking about is that there's a longstanding history validating how local, state, and federal law enforcement has used white supremacist groups, such as the Ku Klux Klan, to maintain racial domination as both public spectacle and hooded secrecy. And so, for instance, some years back when that video went viral of like a police officer fist bumping someone that was a member of like the Proud Boys. I wasn't surprised as a scholar because I saw it and I'm like, this is, as we would say as a historical sociologist, this is a social and historical pattern, right? That there are times when certain populations become defined as a threat or certain types of politics become threatening. It is common to see these alliances across race that blur the notion of who's a civilian and who's law enforcement. And finding a commonality in race to then target another population. And so Hugo's life and death, they really bring to the forefront this paradox. And in the context of California, right, if this history is taking place in this way, then how did 4 prisoner organizations develop beginning in the 1950s? It's, in thinking of this case, it's one question is why California, right? Why California? Because it's pretty remarkable that the organizations I named, they're all being founded in one state, and the majority within one prison call that prison as their original origin institution before they spread. And so we have to think about why California, but then based off of everything I have told you so far, we have to think about what role does the state play in all of this. So for one, in California, I found in internal correspondence that top prison officials were especially concerned because the late 1950s brought a noticeable increase in Black incarcerated people, many of whom were connected to the civil rights movement in society or were seen by prison officials as being sympathetic to the cause of Black liberation and freedom. And so the state of California is undergoing during this time period significant demographic changes. Spurred in part, we can think about there's these long-standing and consecutive waves of Black migration from the American South, right? So how I started with Hugo and his family's migration from Nicaragua to other people who become incarcerated in California, especially amongst the Black population, many themselves were also migrants, but from the American South. And they are fleeing Jim Crow. They're fleeing racial violence and looking for opportunities. This is something that came up in my interviews because the way that I interview people is life history style. So we're not just starting with incarceration. We start with childhood and go all the way to the present moment. And so I was able to learn. I would have known this from history and from the archives. I would have known that California underwent significant changes, but I wouldn't have known it in the words of the people I interviewed if I didn't ask them, if I didn't start early in their lives. And so I will never forget one person who very much, during his incarceration, he becomes an early member of the Black guerrilla family, but he was also a Black Panther on the outside. So he said it very clearly to me. He's like, my family is originally from Alabama, and then we made our way here to California. And as a kid, I saw the Klan. So as soon as I saw, he called them the Nazi boys. He's like, when they get incarcerated, I saw the Nazi boys with swastikas. I see them, making plots with the officers. I already know what this is because as a kid, I saw this. I saw that many of the Klansmen were law enforcement. By day and by night, they were hooded. So you see that the point being is that when people are incarcerated, they're bringing with them this history. They're bringing with them their experiences, their identities and belief systems to the total institution that is the prison setting. And that's very important when thinking about how prison is very much a microcosm of what we see in society. And it's not this walled off place that isn't impacted by all of this. And so when people were migrating to California, what they actually found was staunch resistance by white Californians, with the growing Black population expanding historically Black California neighborhoods, and people tried to build a thriving life for themselves. But even still, they faced police violence, arrest, and incarceration increased as Black Californians were seen as a threat, particularly as the civil rights movement boomed and eventually the Black Power movement rose up. And so thinking, historically and sociologically of this as a pattern, what we're really seeing here is how when people are migrating in mass to a new area, people that are being labeled as threatening, people that are becoming racialized, we see carceral institutions being mobilized to then capture them and incarcerate them. So we can see how it's a through line, right, and not isolated, and we can apply that pattern to other populations, either in the past or also in the present. And so I conducted an interview, not just with people who served time or who joined organizations. I also conducted interviews with people who were a part of movements on the outside. When I realized just how interconnected the prisons and what's happening on the outside is, I knew I had to interview people who were on the outside during the time period of interest. And so I interviewed a woman whose family had settled in Oakland, California during this period. And she eventually joined what would become the Black Panther Party in the 1960s. And so she became a leading voice. So I give her a pseudonym in the book because you would know who she is if I said that. But I give her a pseudonym just like I give everyone who is living. But she explained to me the political climate of the 50s and 60s and how Black people, and in California in particular, were mobilized by their collective experiences. And so I'm going to just read a little snippet from the interview that I did with her because I think it's especially telling and I want us to talk about it after. So listen closely. So this is what she said to me. She said, "Oakland is probably very much the ideal place because Oakland had been an all-white city up until the 1940s, when during the second Great Migration, Blacks came to Oakland, as they did to Chicago, from the South, mostly in this case, Louisiana and Texas, to work on the docks and to answer the call to come and build ships, what have you. So Oakland went from being a white city to an almost half Black city in like one generation. In the South, where you had the main part of the movement, where the majority of Black people had been living, the whites were so violent and vicious. Wasn't nobody going to talk about, well, I'm just going to go here and do this and do that? Nobody would have thought that. In the North, like Philadelphia, Baltimore, the older cities, people had settled in the ghettos. They had made their peace, we could say, with a white world and a Black world. But they weren't under the gun because you could vote in Philadelphia, but you couldn't go to the beach. There were some theaters you couldn't go to, restaurants you couldn't go to. So there was segregation, but you could still live your life in Philadelphia, New York. You couldn't do that in the South. Now, why is that important? Because who joins the Black Panther Party? Are the people who are living in the North because they're already disconnected from the Klan. So they don't have that fear. They don't have that fear of the Klan. But now they have a consciousness. Who's gonna let somebody, somebody from the North, who's gonna let somebody beat them up and you just sit down and you take it? So you had the urban generation of Northern and you had some Philadelphia and so forth and so on. But on the other end here, this was Huey Newton and Bobby Seale's first generation that grew up in the North. Their parents still had Southern attitudes and Southern ideas, understanding the murders by the Klan and all that. But generally, the majority of Blacks had lived in the South, and the Great Migrations came about because what? We were looking for work, and we couldn't find it in the South. So we walked In some cases, we walked to Detroit, we walked to Chicago, so forth and so on. And those people that settled in the West Coast were actually different from the East Coast, who had been entrenched in life in New York and Philadelphia and Baltimore. Those are old cities. Blacks had been living in those cities for a long time. This was a new group of blacks on the West Coast, end quote. And so this is important because, you know, the Black Panther Party, they're one of the cliques, if you will, in prison that is a part of the co-founding of the Black guerrilla family. Because similar to the Aryan Brotherhood, the Black guerrilla family is this merging of cliques that decide they need to have one flag in order to better organize themselves. And so based on this quote, I want us to really think about this interview with her. And so I will ask the class, what does her explanation of California's changing racial and ethnic dynamic, what does that mean for how communities saw themselves? And how is this going to impact the prison system?
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment.
10 years from today, Lisa Schneider will trade in her office job to become the leader of a pack of dogs. As the owner of her own dog rescue, that is. A second act made possible by the reskilling courses Lisa's taking now with AARP to help make sure her income lives as long as she does. And she can finally run with the big dogs. And the small dogs, who just think they're big dogs. That's why the younger you are, the more you need AARP. Learn more at aarp.org/skills.
Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
So the new generation is not going to be like the old generation where they just lay down and take it, and more of its acceptable passive type of style of living. There's an active aggression to what they're willing to accept and not willing to accept, and that builds a resistance against the new area. And so that's the major difference, is this group's not going to sit back and take it or find a passive nature of it, and that's what I got.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And I think that is this notion, as you're saying, of not sitting down and taking it, right, is very present in how she's describing that era. And even so, I did a lot of my interviews just having dinner with people, and sometimes their families would be there, their friends, and we're sitting eating dinner. And I remember in this interview, she stood up and she was very passionate about it, right? And you could just tell it's she's not speaking about other people's lives. This is something that she lived. And so what does that tell us, right, about this ingraining of identity in a sense of, who you are positioned against, and who you have to defend yourself from? And how, when someone is experiencing that, what happens when they become incarcerated? You don't lose that. You don't lose those experiences, what you saw, you bring that with you. And it's something that becomes really telling for everyone, not just one particular side, as we will see. So thank you. So because of this pretty palpable, sense of, I would say it is a sense of resistance, but it's also, as we can glean from her quote, it's like a sense of, we came all this way to California, we're not going to take this. This is not why we came here. Our ancestors came all this way because we were going to start over from the American South. And so that, sense is not lost on corrections officials. It's also not lost on incarcerated people who are racist at the time. And so how can this play out? I can give you an example. So, right, if you're used to Black people knowing their place, and you're used to potentially, maybe bumping into someone and they're going to say, oops, sorry. What happens if you're inside and you bump someone and they look at you and they're like, you're moving, not me? And we're thinking about an era when Black people are told, right, this is your place. And that you look down. You don't even, at this time, in this time period, you couldn't even look white people in the eye in many parts of the United States without potentially facing violence. So this is a changing group and also an increasing group, because this is pre-mass incarceration, but rates of Black incarceration are still higher than rates of white incarceration when we're looking at the early 60s. And this is before the era that we traditionally think about when we're thinking about mass incarceration. And so the Department of Corrections in California, they're worried. And so when I combed through the archives, and I visited a variety of different types of archives, the state archives, which allowed me to look at their internal correspondence. I think my favorite archive was someone who was in the original Black Panther Party. His attic was an archive, so it was a private archive that he kept everything, and people would deposit things to him. So it's almost like what a colleague of mine calls it a rebel archive in her work, because it's an active keeping of materials so that way if something's incorrect in the official state narrative, you can have, proof, right? As I would say, as a millennial, we have receipts. So I'm very proud that my generation came up with that term. I think it's great. But so basically, like that was actually my favorite archive, but I did go to the state archives, and I did manage to gain access to department records and their secret investigations, which is why I liken it to COINTELPRO, because it was in that spirit, and during the same era, they're having these secret investigations. So they're very worried, they're writing letters back and forth and memos, and they decided that to control this new generation and prevent Black liberation from thriving, and they really didn't want it to spread, that they would use the adjustment center as the optimal policy solution. And so they issued these memos listing what they called special procedures for dealing with them. And adjustment centers, they are solitary confinement cells where mostly correctional officers oversee the treatment of what are termed problem cases. And the disciplinary committee would use this language. And so what's important to note is that problem cases were very subjective. It's very subjective during this time period, and quite someone said this to me recently, it's quite Orwellian. Like, it's very subjective. If you were labeled a problem case, what happens to you is you're disappeared into a prison within a prison, which is the adjustment center. So they would be identified and then disappeared and removed, and there would be an official file for them. And they were seen as behavioral problems. And so this started happening systematically to people who were self-described as Black militants, and the documentation that I have is that it systematically starts happening in 1958 with the first special procedures memo that I was able to find. The oldest one I was able to find was in 1958. So not only did they face solitary in these adjustment center units, but they also faced what I call extra-legal punishments. And so what that means is they were facing punishments that were routine. They became a routine part of the prison as a system and as an organization, but they're not considered official policy. So this could be, for example, being set up in a gladiator fight to fight someone of another race, and correctional officers would set these up. And it, as you could imagine, would strengthen the animus between racial groups and create vendettas and revenge killings. It served its purpose very well. It was one of the best tools of political warfare, was sowing division through gladiator fights. Another tool would be setting up people for assaults. So there was there's so many examples of this that I can give, but I'll wait because I'm going to give some when I describe a bit more in a bit. But basically, people were constantly fighting for their lives. And that was the environment that was created, and it was done on purpose to prevent people from successfully organizing against it within their group, but then also from seeing each other as allies, because they're constantly fighting each other. So in an interview I did with one man who eventually went on to co-found the Black Guerrilla Family with Hugo in 1970 as a way to fight back, at least for Black incarcerated people, he outlined for me and everything he saw in this interview and everything he survived. And I call him Benjamin as a pseudonym to protect him and his family. But this is what he said to me, and this is brief, and I'm quoting. He said, "Man, I just turned 17, but they were sending people like me and other people there. I was put in a hole, and I was told by the guard that while they, white prisoners, may spit in my face, for me not to do anything and just go along with it. I remember people yelling, N-word, 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 all night long. You can hear that, you know, and that was part of the racism then. You were 17 years old and you had mother effers calling you the N-word all night," end quote. So I ask you all, I asked the class, what does his experience tell you? What do you think when you hear that, when someone's experiencing that in the context of everything? What is he telling us? And why should we care?
I guess he's telling us how racism is very deeply embedded in our prison systems, and then those in higher elite positions use racism as a way to keep certain marginalized communities down and others up.
Yes, absolutely. And I appreciate you for using that word elite, because that's very important. Because we're seeing in his explanation, we're seeing two elites, right? So who are the two elites that we're seeing? Because it's not just the typical elite, we're seeing two.
I guess he was seeing as like both the white prisoners and then the police officers telling the Black prisoners, just take it. Like, just know your place, I guess.
Yes, absolutely. So we're seeing here that you have your traditional elite that you would see in a total institution, right? When we learn about how prisons are organized, you have this very strong distinction between who's an officer and who's an inmate, and officers are elites in this social group, social system. But in his quote and what I have explained to you so far, you see that this system is also creating prisoner elites. And, you know, prisoner elites can be created based on race. I won't get into it now because it would take me on a long tangent, but prisoner elites are also created through work assignments. But as scholars have shown, work assignments in prison are very racialized. So there's the creation of elites is very important. So thank you for that. And also we're seeing here that if white incarcerated people, and not just white incarcerated people, but particularly white incarcerated people that are willing to buy into the racist system in a very overt way, are getting rewarded. And getting rewarded in tangible ways in this system. And so there is an incentive. There's an incentive because you're getting rewarded with social capital, but you're gaining economic capital, right? Because the Aryan Brotherhood ends up becoming the biggest drug dealing organization, at least in this time period, in California prisons. And it doesn't happen without the help of corrupt correctional officers, putting them on a pedestal and giving them a platform. So this is very important. And so to understand this creation of elites, how this system is forming, where people are picking sides and formally organizing themselves on those sides, I also did life history interviews with people from very different walks of life. That were formerly imprisoned. And so I did also interview people that eventually, during their incarceration, joined groups like the Aryan Brotherhood and the Aryan Warriors in terms of becoming official affiliates or actually joining. I did interview people that joined. So let's turn to some of their stories, and I think that they will illuminate a lot for us. And so their stories are important for a number of reasons, because I talked about if you're pedestaling different types of prisoner elites on the basis of race and racism, this is allowing correctional officers to weaponize race and wield race as a tool of war, and to use extra legal control strategies to immobilize the Black population, and to kind of especially target people that they saw as being threats because of their ability to mobilize. So anyone who was seen, talking political rhetoric, talking about the civil rights movement of the time, is going to have a target on their back. And so correctional officers encouraged incarcerated white people to become more racist as well, and to use incendiary remarks and to fuel the flames of racism within the institutions. And so I will read a brief quote from a white man that was incarcerated in San Quentin, and he's recounting this type of behavior. And so what he has to say is very important. And I quote, he says, "The guards here, they stir up prisoners. There hasn't been a serious race riot here now for over a year, and things were going pretty smoothly. But the guards started spreading rumors that the cells were going to be integrated just to make things tense. No one wants that. The whites do not want to live with the blacks, and the blacks don't want to live with the whites. The guards come up to a white prisoner in his cell and say, 'How would you like a black cell partner?' That gets the white prisoner uptight and increases the tensions in the prison." End quote. And so his words are actually supported by similar claims from an incarcerated man that he self-identified as Chicano. And so this is a quote from him. He says, "There was a fight between a black and white inmate. The black guy won the fight, and even though the white guy put up a good fight, the guards then said to the white inmates, 'Man, that black dude really dusted the white dude. I thought you white dudes could fight better than that.' The guard said that because they hoped to start another fight." End quote. And so another interesting point along these lines is that a white man that was also incarcerated in San Quentin, who self-identified as a Nazi, actually, the sect that would originally combine with bikers to form the Aryan Brotherhood in San Quentin, so he didn't mind that the officers were helping. He felt that the officers were justified in supplying incarcerated white people, for example, with street knives, versus other groups are having to make little shanks to defend themselves. And he felt like this was a good system for them. Because if it was not for their alliance with correctional officers in their shared mission to declare war on the black population and to suppress the civil rights movement within California prisons, the Aryan Brotherhood wouldn't have been able to form. It wouldn't have been able to amass the tangible economic and political capital that it did in a short span of years from the 1960s onward, beginning in San Quentin. And so he's like, why would we question this and complain that the officers are actually doing things that are helping us? And so the person I'm about to quote, he adamantly believed that that black, self-described black militants were a threat. He said they will plot to physically harm us, essentially, kind of pointing to, at the time, different protests that are happening in society on behalf of black civil rights. He's like, they're going to bring that here. So this is a real threat. We're not over-exaggerating. And he felt like it was especially acute because he's like, black militants, their numbers are growing. So this is real for us. And I will briefly read a comment where he's describing why is he supporting this. And I'm quoting. He says, "One of the N-words who stabbed a white, he was called Big Jim. We knew that he had done the stabbing. The day after he stabbed this white guy, he went on to court to an appeal that he had filed before. A sergeant came up to one of the bikers and said to him, 'We know that Big Jim did one of the stabbings.' We would rather have him carried off to the hospital than to have to try to make a real case against him in court for the stabbings. I'll see that nothing happens to you for doing this. I'll make it worth your trouble." End quote. And the bike riders will be waiting for Big Jim when he gets back from court. "I know the guy the sergeant talked to well. Everyone knows that he has been involved in sticking the spooks. I know for a fact that he recently stabbed the N-word and killed him. If it weren't for guys like this, I think the blacks would cause even more trouble than they do." End quote. So using our insight from what we've learned so far, how can we understand the politics of the situation that they're describing? Because essentially what he is describing in that narrative is how a sergeant has said to the white group that we understand one of yours got stabbed, and so we will look the other way if you want to take care of him because that will make things easier for us. What is this telling us about this climate, if you will, the political climate? Anyone? There's no wrong answers.
That the guards can incentivize violence to serve their needs and leverage whatever racial group they need to. And in this case, it was to incentivize the whites to take care of the blacks in hopes or in terms of trying to maintain a control or assist them in maintaining a control status.
Yep, absolutely. So it's this vignette and kind of what he's describing, right, it's providing more evidence to this argument that, you know, the lines are blurred. There's not this black and white dichotomy when we're thinking about the role of the state, right, and state actors and the formation of organizations that eventually become gangs in the eyes of the prison system, right? These are organizations that are forming in tandem with very concrete intervention by people that are acting on behalf of the state. And that's the really important point here. And why, as I started this lecture, I problematized the notion of prison gang, and why I believe that as a scholar and as scholars in this room, it's much more fruitful if we conceptualize of groups as prisoner organizations, because then we can trace their formation without allowing state labels such as the word prisoner or labels such as the word gang to cloud our intellectual judgment and our ability to analyze situations and to analyze formations over time. So as I am starting to kind of get toward the end, one of the most important things that I've learned in researching this history is that I really want to make clear that it's simultaneously true that incarcerated white people during this period I'm describing often felt compelled to align with or officially join white supremacist groups. So I say this, and it's important because, again, it points to how the state and state actors are actually intervening in the social system within prisons to punish, if you will, people that are falling out of line. And so we can think about this even in the context of society during this era, right, in the civil rights era, right? Think about a white person who allows a black person to come inside and sit in the front during the middle of what we know as Jim Crow. That white person is also putting themselves at risk because they're violating the norms and the system of control and racial governance of the time. The same thing is true about California prisons, and that's very important because just as we can't think of these blanket essentialist dichotomies in terms of organizations, we also can't think of that within racial groups, right? There's different types of people in every group. And so I want to kind of highlight a person in particular that I interviewed. I think that his story really shows this well. So in my book, I give him the pseudonym Andrew. And I talk about him in the chapter I call White Above All. And I call the chapter that because I chronicle what I just read to you in terms of officer interventions in the system and punishing people who are falling out of line, even their own. But also I interviewed people who described to me how prison fundamentally turned them into a racist and groomed them to join white supremacist groups such as Aryan Warriors or such as the Aryan Brotherhood. And that's very important because it shows the power of the institution. It shows, as I led with earlier, people are bringing in pre-existing identities. So this man named Andrew, he actually grew up in Chicago and saw himself as a Chicagoan, and he called himself a poor white. That's a term that he used for himself, and it was very important for how he saw himself. He said he grew up in a working class Chicago neighborhood with people of all racial groups around him. And so he never saw himself as racist. He comes to California, so he also migrates, right? He comes to California as a kid with his family, and through a series of unfortunate events ends up incarcerated. And so when I interviewed Andrew, he had served life, and there's a different types of circumstances that led to his release, but he was actually sentenced to life. But when I interviewed Andrew, he had many tattoos from his time in prisons. He had swastikas on his hands. He was constantly fidgeting, I think because of my positionality and like trying to cover them. But we got to know each other well over the course of a few days, and I was able to help him be at ease. And, in my it's important to me as a researcher to help people see and feel the humanity of the space, right? I don't want to cause harm to anyone, and I don't want to also reproduce the labels that I'm studying. So I did my best to create an open space, and I think it served really well in this case because Andrew really opened up. He described to me, through his incarceration, how some of the most horrific things that he saw really pushed him into getting those tattoos, joining the groups that he joined, because he witnessed the officers set up an incarcerated white person who grew up in a black neighborhood, who kept socializing with black people in the prison. And so to make an example out of him, he witnessed officers set this person up to be viciously assaulted. And he said to me, I will never forget that interview, because he stood up and he was pacing and we had to stop for a moment, and he said to me, and he was crying and sobbing, and he was like, I never want that to happen to me. And I describe his story in depth in the book because as I said, I never want to cause harm by dehumanizing anyone, because everyone has a story in terms of how did they get to where they are and what they survived. And Andrew's story is also super, it's hopeful. It brought a lot of hope to me, because something I pointed out to him, which is, I will end toward this point, something that I noticed when I was sitting there talking to him on this porch in LA, on this big house that was run by a nonprofit. I'm sitting on the porch and I'm like, Andrew, I can't help but notice that you're volunteering in this nonprofit in Los Angeles with trying to help for men that are incarcerated that are going to get out. And you're volunteering with men of all races and who openly, I'm not revealing anybody's status, but who openly have said their organizational affiliation when they were in prison. And they were a part of groups like the Mexican Mafia and street gangs, as they're labeled, like the Crips and Bloods, who become aligned with the Black Guerrilla family. How are you volunteering? I just want to know, because I am struck by it. And the camaraderie that I see every day amongst you all working together. And he explained to me, this also really connected the dots for me in thinking of the history of these organizations and the role of the state and what happens when people aren't incarcerated anymore. And he said to me, he's like, here on the outside, we don't need it. We don't need those banners or flags. We aren't fighting a war out here. Or what he was insinuating is we don't have to be. We all have a single mission out here to help other men overcome incarceration. And I remember he had tears in his eyes because he kind of motioned back, and he's like motioning because he's like, some of those men in there right now, like they wrote to me when I was in prison, and they helped me, and it like just describing how it just reframed for him everything. And so I want to bring us actually to my last slide on this point. What happens, right, when people that have been groomed by the state to fight each other, what happens when people wake up to the situation? You know, what does that look like? And so once Pelican Bay Supermax opened in California in 1989, it wasn't just Black Guerrilla Family co-founders like Hugo Pennell, who we learned about, who were quickly shipped off to our state's first Supermax prison, which would become a breeding ground for correctional officers setting up people in gladiator fights. So that's something I actually, in Andrew's interview, it was one of the most difficult parts of the interview when he was describing being set up in a gladiator fight in Pelican Bay. And like it's the type of thing as a scholar, you know, you can experience vicarious trauma by working with and doing deep research with people that have survived horrific things. And I'll never forget that because I had to do a whole process to kind of recompose myself after that session. But he described in very, vivid detail about what it is like to survive that. I also, I learned in my research from various sources about how in Pelican Bay became a breeding ground for labeling people as snitches. So again, another example about how labels in a prison setting really can kill. And also what's important is that these are all tactics that are becoming institutionalized over time, with self-described Black militant prisoners being like the test population. That's what's also very important. It's like all these tactics where wardens are looking the other way, or they're encouraging it and they're allowing it. Over time, it becomes a routine way of being. That's what's important. That's a takeaway when thinking about when something is institutionalized. Oftentimes we also just take it for granted as a way of life, but it has an origin. And so in Pelican Bay, you see, once it's opened in 1989, it becomes the place where these tactics of control that are official and extra legal are really destroying the original leaders of these four major groups. So in 2012, something notable happened though. Something that members of the Black Guerrilla Family had wanted to happen since they founded the organization. And this was cross-racial mobilization around the notion of a prisoner class. And it superseded the Department of Corrections' century-long effort to really keep people racially divided and fighting each other and creating these hierarchies. And so the leaders of the four major prisoner organizations, which to this day are known as prison gangs or security threat groups in California, they banded together to initiate a series of hunger strikes across prisons in our state. And they also followed up with a joint lawsuit against the department. And their attorneys released a statement from them about how sitting in isolation and ending up in Pelican Bay together, it really reshifted their consciousness in terms of what the department had been doing for decades, and the fact that they were all enemies, but they all ended up in the same place, in the secure housing unit, and subjected to the same fates. So in 2012, they released a statement signed it and called it the Agreement to End Hostilities. And I really encourage you, if you look up the Center for Constitutional Rights, you can watch some of the videotaped interviews that the attorneys did with the leaders of these groups, describing in their own words how sitting next to their former enemies changed them and changed the way they saw these battles over the years, and encourage them to organize themselves behind this agreement. And so in this agreement that they signed, and you can see these are all leaders of those 4 different groups, they said, and I'm quoting, "We can no longer allow CDCR to use us against each other for their benefit. Because the reality is that collectively we are an empowered, mighty force that can positively change this entire corrupt system into a system that actually benefits prisoners and thereby the public as a whole," end quote. And so the final point I want to bring to your attention is this is where the life and death of Hugo Pinnell comes full circle, because only 3 years after this is when Hugo Pinnell is allegedly set up by correctional officers to be stabbed to death by rogue members of the Aryan Brotherhood. And so this happens 2 weeks after his release from isolation. So he had been in solitary all those decades, and he comes out 2 weeks after, and he's murdered in the general population. And so much of the work of incarcerated people's led efforts to really foster this cross-racial mobilization against the Department of Corrections, it breaks down in the wake of Hugo's murder. So I want to end here, and I want to, have us just think for a moment. I want us to think, what does this agreement show us? And also, in what way is the term prison gang, how is it a social label and something that we shouldn't take for granted? Were you all aware of kind of the different complexities of what it would mean to organize into an organization or organize into what becomes known as a prison gang? I'm curious if anything surprised you or if there were things that you all knew.
Like, just seeing how you explain the hierarchical structure within the prison system, so like not only the elite police officers but also like the white prisoners. I thought that was very interesting.
And do you feel like it was surprising, or was it something that was it shocking, or more like, oh, you could see that happening?
I could see that happening, but it was really interesting to see how like the police specifically like kind of turned them against each other to like promote violence.
Referred to like gladiator style prisons. I've never heard it in that terms, but it does make sense considering like just like gladiator fights as like an ancient practice. Like it's always for the benefit of the elite, like it's for the entertainment of the elite, or they get money off of it. So it's interesting how it, even though it's a different form in prisons, but it still kind of functions that way, like someone else is gaining from 2 people risking their lives and probably losing their lives.
Yep, absolutely. There's a lot of incentive to do it, right, as we saw, because it not only creates these divisions where it's easier then to control a huge population that does outnumber you. But it also, it provides a sense of, in Irving Goffman, when he writes about total institutions, talks about how there are, psychological benefits to being in the elite group. And so watching this sort of collective degradation happening, it gives you, it even gives you a feeling of being better than everyone else. And so the gladiator fights, they do that for officers in a way that's very effective. And also it's interesting that, most gladiators were actually prisoners of war. And so there's a very intimate history between the notion of a gladiator fight and prisons.
I had no idea that the leaders of these organizations were where their mind was and how they were so aware of the structures around them and the institution. And I think that really puts in perspective of your idea of these organizations being organizations and not gangs, because there's very, it really runs against the common narrative of gangs, the media sells to us, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that's a very good point. And it's why, I opened up with the statement about how organizations that have that structure, right, whether they're considered mafias, street gangs, or, prison gangs or rebel groups, there's always a very direct link between populations experiencing degradation and the need for political mobilization that then becomes criminalized by the state and also can morph and shift into different ways and take different forms at different periods in time. And so, when I first became interested in this topic, one of the first groups I did study was actually the Sicilian Mafia, because I was so interested in how, at least from what I had learned up until that point in my journey when I was a student, I hadn't learned, just how the banding together, especially in Sicily, of the different families, it was for protection at first. And so that's the link that I want you all to think about is, any organization that has this a very stigmatizing criminal label, irregardless of their present day actions, if you look historically, you often will see these very strong links to social movement organization that then are often co-opted by the state. So in the case of, for example, the Black Guerrilla Family, many of its early co-founders are put in isolation cells, which completely reshapes the entire organization's direction. But you could argue that it's done on purpose, because they're the most dangerous in the eyes of prison officials because they're using political rhetoric to radicalize people. And it's actually people who are caught with, drugs and other paraphernalia that are allowed to be they're let go because they're not the real threat. And that's why I think problematizing the gang label is and not leaving out the state's role is very key when looking at these histories. Are there any other thoughts or questions? I appreciate you all today. Yes.
I just have another question, because I know that there are different levels of security in prisons. Folsom is a different security level than San Quentin, which is different than other ones too. And there's Newsom has been talking about making San Quentin into a Scandinavian style prison with more open air recreational facilities, more opportunities, more activities. What are your thoughts on how the structure or security level of a prison impacts the ability that officers have to reinforce the formation of prison organizations, or how do you think a Scandinavian prison would change that, if at all?
I think that's a very good question. I what I do think is interesting is that if you do look beyond the U.S., so I explained to you kind of like, how California is important for the U.S. story of the main groups. But if you look at other places, like, I've always been interested in the Brazilian prison system, that I almost ended up doing a comparison between Brazil and the U.S., but I ended up with U.S. But it's because the biggest groups that become prison gangs in Brazil, they also come out of struggle. They are formed because there was a massacre by the military police where they killed scores of incarcerated people, and as a way to protect themselves, they form an organization that becomes now Brazil's biggest prison gang, which is the PCC. You see a similar thing in Russia, right? In Russian prisons. And I would argue that, in Scandinavian countries, they do have a different trajectory than other countries that I have looked at and I have an interest in studying more in depth, that do have this legacy of having, very clear human rights violations and people that you could consider to be political prisoners, and what ends up becoming organizational formation as a means of protection that's then criminalized and becomes known as a gang. Because you also see it too. One of my favorite lessons to teach is the history of Irish political prisoners and the relationship to the IRA. So again, it's like I do think there is something to that, and I think empirically it is something that's worthy of study.
So, for example, like, how influential is your life outside of prison before you go to prison? Like, if you're, like, financially well off, or if you have some sort of status before you go into prison, like, how does that affect your position in, like, your gang or in whatever group you're in? Or does it affect it at all?
So it's very important. So in theories of, we would call this theories of prisonization. Have you all learned theories of prisonization yet? You may not have learned it because we're early. Yeah, we're early in the semester. But so theories of prisonization, there's this long debate that's been going on since like the 40s between scholars who argue that the importation model of culture is more important. So it's what you're saying. You're importing in your identity, your wealth, your educational attainment, your region. And then there's scholars who are arguing for the deprivation model of prison culture. And the deprivation model is very much Goffman and total institutions, and this idea that prisons are, totally inescapable. There's routines of degradation. You lose your name for a number, and all these rituals are what matter the most. But, I think current scholars really have settled on that it is a true blend, but importation kind of wins a little bit, if that makes sense. Like importation is a little bit more important than the deprivation model because people don't fully lose all of those characteristics when they go in. But of course, as I have laid out today, right, their experiences in prison and the way the institution is structured are especially important. Because it can act as a framing institution. You can come in with one set of ideals and identity, as I showed you all with Andrew, and be fundamentally reshaped. But it's a back and forth in research about which one matters more. There is a real debate that continues in the present.
Correctional officers, there's kind of this idea of like preservation and holding these values in like playing that higher role, but one can argue that they're the most at danger when they're in these prisons as like working there. Do you think that when correctional officers do this kind of hierarchical system, do they think that when these prisoners leave, they're gonna hold those values in their mind, hoping that if they were to ever come back, they'd reinforce those same values? Or are they thinking more stably of like, I'm trying to survive on my own here as a correctional officer?
I think I would argue that it's often the latter. So they're thinking within the institution, and gosh, I mean, they even now in the present, their shifts are wild in terms of how many hours they're inside of an institution at any given shift. So they're thinking in those terms. But, you know, what's interesting is a colleague and a mentor of mine, his name's Patrick Lopez Aguado, and he wrote this really great book called Stick Together and Come Back Home. And I love that book because it shows, if you're interested in everything I've talked about, it shows very well the impact of what I've described on neighborhoods and how when people go home, they are bringing with them these battles and the race wars and how it fundamentally shifts neighborhoods in California in particular. And so much of what we, you know, things that we might see depending on where you're from, right, in your own community or that you might read about, like if we look to California prisons, you can have a better understanding of what's going on the street level.
Another question. How does this all play into like prisons with women? Is there like a different dynamic in terms of like race is added into it? Obviously there must be, but in terms of how does being a woman change this whole dynamic?
So I think that is a brilliant question. You know, I would say it's in terms of what I have described, I would argue I don't think it's been not studied in that sense in terms of the race wars and battles. I do think there's excellent historiography on women's prisons. I would say a scholar to look at would be Victoria Law. Has excellent work on women's prisons, especially women's mobilization against what is often, you know, very gendered violence in women's prisons. So I would speak to that, but it is an area I have an interest in. And also I have very good doctoral students, and one of them is studying California women's prisons, and so like I'm happy about that because there is a need. Thank you. Well, I really appreciate you all today. I appreciate your questions. I want you to know that, you know, I'm here, I'm in sociology with Rob, who's my colleague, and so you can email me if you have any other questions or thoughts. I appreciate being able to teach you all today, and I hope you learned a lot. I hope it was interesting. So thank you for your time, and thanks for your questions. They were great. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's Lectures in History podcast. To find even more history content, visit our website at cspan.org.